Welcome back to the Patriot Podcast. My name is Adam, and today we're going to be talking about voting in the 2024 United States presidential election, the candidacies, and all that stuff coming up. See you on the other side. Welcome back to the Patriot Podcast. My name is Adam, and today we're going to be talking about voting, the presidential election, and we're going to be doing it from the perspective of how we should be thinking. This isn't who you should vote for. A lot of the channels that are out there that are talking about the upcoming presidential election in the United States are all going to be talking about candidates, candidacies. They're all going to be talking about issues. They're all going to be presenting their points, and many of them will just be parroting what other people are already saying. I don't want to do that. I want to use this opportunity in this particular channel to talk about how I'm thinking through who I am interested in as a presidential candidate and why I think that's important, because of the Chinese proverb. We talk about it. If you give a man a fish, he'll be fed for a day. You teach a man to fish, he'll be fed for a lifetime. What our schools should really be doing, and this is in my opinion, and in college, what they should be doing is teaching you how to think, not what to think. As soon as we dissociate away from teaching people how to think critically for themselves, what we do is we indenture somebody into servitude over an opinion. And so instead of telling you, whomever is watching this video, instead of telling you who you should vote for and aligning with a certain party, I would rather take a deeper dive into the critical thinking behind the candidacy selection. And that's my perspective on this issue. And I took some time I've been watching a lot of information on the candidates and the far left and the far right and the moderates and the liberals and all this stuff, freedom of speech and the woke movement. I mean, I feel like I have absolutely been consumed with all of that information. I mean, it's like as soon as you type a word into YouTube, the algorithm all of a sudden pops up every single type of video that pertains to that issue. And then it seems like you can't get away from it. Once you try to study that information, or you study that topic or that candidate or that perspective or that opinion, it's obviously the algorithm of YouTube wants to keep you on the channel, and they're just going to keep force feeding you now all this information. Like I've been watching a lot of Ben Shapiro videos, and it's like now all of a sudden in my news feed, every single thing is about Ben Shapiro. And God love Ben Shapiro. I love Ben. Don't get me wrong. I think he's a very intelligent man, and he has a subtle wit about him. Not even subtle, really, truly. I mean, he's a gangster disguised in a suit. He really is a good guy. But that being said, it's just what we have to deal with now in our society because of the internet. We have information overload. We have media on TV. Yes, legacy media that tells us who we should vote for, and not necessarily just what the issues are, but how you should be thinking about those issues. And to me, that's the problem that I have with the current media that is available to us in legacy media. So I don't watch Fox News. I only looked up information on the internet so that I could have a good understanding of how far these media companies have fastened themselves to a certain opinion and aligned with that opinion. That's all I did, and that's all I wanted to know. And it's kind of the same thing with, on the far left, when you have the Democrats. So getting all of those opinions is valuable so you can understand what people's opinions are and where they're coming from. But at the same time, I only did that so that I could understand more so and reflect on this idea of leadership, because ultimately that's what this video is about. That's what this conversation is about. That's what this topic is truly about. When you talk about candidacy for presidencies or any form of leadership, that's what we have to boil it down to. So before we get overwhelmed with who we should vote for and what the issues are, we can't get distracted away from the true core issue behind all of that. And that is leadership. Who is the most qualified person to lead the free nation, right? The leaders of the free world. Who is the most competent? Who has the best qualities? Who has the best skills? Who represents the country the best? That is truly what we should be focusing on. So when I thought about leadership, it reminded me of this idea of servant leadership. And there's a man named Robert Greenleaf, who in 1970 wrote an essay called "Servant as Leader." And he developed this concept of servant leadership. He borrowed from an article that was written in the 1930s, but still, that person borrowed from the Jesus model, which is person who serves and leads at the same time, somebody who walks out what they talk about. And that's what, in my opinion, we should be looking for. That's how we should be orienting our perspectives on how we should be voting for somebody. So now I got this definition. You can get it off of Wikipedia. You can find it anywhere. I'm just going to read some of this definition to you to give you what I think what even Wikipedia says. It says servant leadership is a leadership philosophy in which the goal of the leader is to serve. This is different from traditional leadership, where the leader's main focus is the thriving of their own company or their own organization. A servant leader shares power, puts the needs of employees first, and helps people develop and perform as highly as possible. Instead of people working to serve the leader exists to serve the people. As stated by its founder, Robert Greenleaf, a servant leader should be focused on, do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to become servants? Okay. So take that in for a second. Think about that. Now apply that concept, apply that definition that you can get from Wikipedia, and apply that to the US presidency or any presidency in any Democratic run election. Apply that same concept. Are the people of the nation healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, and more likely to become servants themselves? So apply that to the current president. Apply that to the previous president. Apply that and go, and just go all the way back. And you can now use that as a lens to then see the world through the eyes that I'm seeing it through, which is through the lens of servant leadership. Because it's really truly what the model of the biblical model provides to us. The New Testament, the leadership that you see in the New Testament is Jesus being a perfect example of leader, somebody who's willing to lay his life down for the lives of his disciples, to set an example for the people who were following after him, to be above reproach, to demonstrate the qualities in himself, to live out his truth, and to teach his disciples to become an autonomous agent. I've been reading this book called Exclusion and Embrace. I don't know if you can see this, but it's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it to anybody who is interested in learning more about the theology of, first of all, Christian theology, but the theology of exclusion and embrace, and how the idea of the cross is a center point for us to be able to become a more healthy person, and then a healthy leader, and then eventually a healthy nation as a result of creating individual agency in the person, instead of creating a bunch of automatons that agree with a certain political framework or a political ideal. This is the idea of creating agents of change. And that is what Jesus did. He created agents of change. So when you're thinking about this, whether you're religious or not, the idea is, are you an agent to create freedom in your own life and in the lives of other people? Are you an agent that creates happiness, wealth? Are you that? And that is ultimately what we want to think about when we think about who we are going to be electing as a presidential candidate, who best exemplifies these qualities. So, because I have no allegiance to a particular candidate, well, then I feel like I can trust my own opinion, right? I mean, I think that's part of this is when you think about what news you're watching, think about who's getting paid for that, right? Like whether it's Fox News, NBC, MSNBC, CBN, CBS, BBC, it doesn't matter. New York Times, there's always a bottom line for those outlets. And that is they want your attention. And why? Because they want the money that comes from that. So what do they use? Well, they use fear tactics to control your attention. If you click off of this video, praise God, because it means you have your own life to live. I really could care less whether you're continuing to watch all the way to the end of this video, even though my analytics would say, oh no, you want to retain retention. You want to keep people on your channel. You want to keep them on YouTube. So what? People have lives. Go live your life. I could really care less. I have my own life to live. I've got kickboxing coming up in a couple hours. If you have a life to live, you should be able to go and live it. Whereas people who are so subsumed by fear and doubt, it's almost like they're handing over their own ability to think to whatever person is talking on the screen. And that's not what we should be doing, especially as somebody like me who wants to be a servant leader, somebody who wants to exemplify the ideas of the biblical idea of being a servant leader like Jesus, is to walk these things out, to be, to know, and to do. If I want to do that, I should be encouraging you to think for yourself. And if that means that you already know what I'm talking about, then click off. But if this is interesting to you, stay with all the way through, because I feel like I have some value to add here. So let's talk about, and I came up with these, I wrote these down. These are 7 different thoughts that I had come up about what I want to see in a presidential candidate. Okay. Number 1, relatable. Somebody who has been through some form of struggle in their life, similar or comparable to mine. And I'm not necessarily saying that they have to have had addictions before, that they had to be abused, neglected, abandoned, rejected. I'm not saying that they have to have military experience like I had it. I'm not saying that they had to be sexually abused like I was when I was a kid. I don't need somebody to have the exact nature of my suffering or my pain, because it's not even suffering anymore. It's more of a sacrifice. I'm turning my pain into a passion. So it's not really suffering. It's more so what God allowed to have happen in my life so that I can turn it and use it to help other people in a kindred spirit form, right? So I feel like I need and I want somebody who I can relate to. That is the face of my issue. Somebody who can then go forward having some type of knowledge or experience that gives them a personal relationship with that form of suffering or indifference or discrimination or challenge, life issue, grief, loss, trauma, you name it. I want somebody who's gone through something, who's been through some stuff, and who has had to work through those issues. Okay. So that's what I'm thinking. So number 1, I'm thinking relatable. Number 2. Oh, you know what? I'm going to give examples of these, because I think it's imperative to show an objective, neutral way of applying this relatable lens to a current presidential candidate. Okay. So first of all, I'm not endorsing or voting for this individual. and I'll explain why later on. But let's take Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Okay. This individual has been through a series of trials in his life, a number of issues. Obviously, his dad was murdered. He was assassinated by the CIA. So, in my opinion, of course, from everything that I've looked at, it seems to me pretty apparent that JFK was assassinated by the CIA and his brother was killed as well. So, where there's smoke, there's fire. You have a considerable amount of information already that we have available to us to suggest that this was an assassination attempt at the highest levels of our government. And so he had early childhood trauma. He lost his dad at an early age. I can relate to that, right? He also struggled with addictions. Okay. He had alcoholism. And for a stretch of his life, I think it was from 19 to 27. I can't quote right off the top of my head because I'm just going based off of the interview that I saw on the Joe Rogan Experience. And then I think he did a couple other podcasts. So he's got that as well. He's got life experience. He has his own interpersonal demons that he had to wrestle and work through. And he used the 12 steps to overcome those. Right? To me, again, that's another example of somebody being relatable. I can relate to somebody who's worked through their steps because I'm working through my own steps, right? Like that I get. That is perfectly relatable. So if it was just based off of that, I would vote for him. But that's not all the criteria that I have in my mind. All right. So using that lens, I'm now refining down of all the available candidates who I would vote for. Relatable. Now, the second that I have is scientific theoretical. That's what I wrote down. Here's what I mean. Somebody who desires to test a hypothesis based on a set of assumptions that they have already observed, that they've studied. Here's what you do in science. When you go to, for example, when I was going to do a dissertation, you have to do a huge comprehensive review of all the literature out there that relates to your topic. So let's say, for example, you want to write a paper on the effects of alcohol on interpersonal relationships. We can do a longevity or a summary, or you can do there's so many different ways you can set up a study. But if, let's say, for example, you want to take a longitudinal study, you want to look at all of the literature that's available from as early as you can get it and do a summary of all that literature, right? Actually, let me change this study. The effects of psilocybin mushrooms on the effectiveness of the 12-step model. That's a better research study. Holy moly, right? So before you can do that study, you have to go through all the literature that relates to alcoholism, addictions, even psilocybin research. You have to do a full-scale analysis of all of those things so that you can build a base of knowledge on that particular topic. Because otherwise you're just winging it. You're making an assumption that could be based off of a false premise. So when I'm thinking about who I want to vote for, I want somebody in office that has a scientific theoretical brain, somebody who has analyzed topics at great detail, has the ability to derive a good quality of information out of that topic, and who can then use that same litmus test and that same ability, that same process that you have to go through to develop a study, to go through the principles of the information, and then on the outset to come into it with a set of ethics, values, and principles that will keep you within the guidelines of a scientific study. Because if you don't, the chances of your result being as a result of an error is much higher, right? So that is what I want to see from the president. Now, again, I'm going to use RFK Jr. as an example again. If it was just based off of this I would have voted for him as well. So theoretically, he would be a good candidate based off of his own history of being a scientist. I believe he has a doctorate, and he worked, I think he was either a lawyer or he worked at, I don't know, either way, he was a scientist. Bottom line is he's a scientist. Okay. And he's done a lot of research. So I know he has the ability to read documents from a literature perspective and from a scientific perspective and be able to deduce what's good research, what's bad research. And why is that important? Well, instead of using and abusing statistics for political gain, like, for example, you could find one research article that says that 95% of African American youth are hungry. Well, that's one piece of evidence. That's one. But then if you open that up and you look at the entire nature and scope of all of the literature, it may end up only being 5% are hungry. And that one statistic was completely off, and it wasn't a representative of the fact. And yet what you'll have is you'll have a political candidate who will take that statistic and then make that the headline of their woke movement to try to increase welfare for Black youth in that particular area, taking more of taxpayers' money and then using that to donate to hungry kids all across America, because that one statistic that they found in one study was a good headline for them. It made people sad. It made people, because that's what it does. Instead of sticking to the facts, they'll appeal to your feelings, and they'll use stats to get your feelings. So you'll see this thing that'll say, oh, 99% of kids are hungry. And it's like, have you ever had a kid before? They're always hungry. Hello. Yeah, I had 5 kids, so I know what it's like to have hungry and have to feed 5 hungry kids. I'll tell you, it is a struggle. So maybe it is 99% of kids are hungry. Anywho, that's the point, right? So you want to have somebody who has scientific integrity when it comes to how they will absorb the information from their environment so that they can make a good decision as a leader. You need that. Eventually, it becomes an intuition. Once you do that process so often, you get really good at it, and you can get really good at intuitively knowing what research is good, what research sucks, and which research can just be tossed out. Right? Like you get really good at figuring out what's the best source of information that you can get. Okay, and you can apply that same concept to what media you're watching. Use that same litmus test. Are they appealing to your feelings, or are they stating facts and trying to be objective about those facts that they are talking about? That would probably eliminate 90% of the media that you watch, or that somebody would watch when it comes to legacy media. Now, this isn't just to sit here and bash them. This is to show how far the media has come in regards to appealing to feeling, using facts to keep you peeled in and aligned with a certain allegiance. This isn't about allegiance, folks. This is about leadership. So when you think about that, RFK Jr. would be a great candidate for that. That's my opinion. All right. So, and by the way, you can also find these, and I'll pull this up. You can find some of these. I'll share my screen here. What makes a good leader? Here we go. Actually found this on a military website. Go to figure. And this is based off of Dr. Howard's work titled Leadership 4 Styles. And you can find a lot of these things. He broke down these qualities of leaders into 4 different subtypes: type A, type B, type C, type D. And if you apply this to the type of presidential candidate that you are most comfortable with, you'll find out, and you can screen that person according to what characteristics you know about them. Right? Are they factual? Are they logical? Are they technical? Are they a combination of technical, flexible, emotional, controlled, whatever? And you just look at that combination of those things, and you can basically distill out the candidates that we have available to us based off of what these things say. Instead of being so over concerned on what Fox News is telling you or what MSNBC is telling you, you can use your own judgment. Shocker. Okay. So, number 3, a history of servanthood. Somebody who has sacrificed their time, energy, money, effort for the greater good of another person. Now, you could say, for example, that somebody like Biden has spent 50 years of his life serving the greater good of other people. Now, let's be careful about that, because I don't necessarily know if being a politician these days is really truly about being a servant. Because if it's self-serving for fame, fortune, connections, business, whatever that may be, if it may start it out as an idea of wanting to serve other people, but if you've been doing it and you've gained something as a result of it, fame, fortune, connections, allegiance with another group of people who are going to give you more influence for your benefit, for your election, for your candidacy, that's not servanthood. It's just not. Okay. So I wouldn't necessarily agree that that would apply to somebody like Biden. So I can't necessarily agree that he would be a good candidate based off of the history of servanthood. All right. Just applying that lens to the candidate. We take Trump, for example. Okay. Let's apply this idea of servanthood to Trump. If you are putting yourself at risk, you're putting yourself out there as a presidential candidate, you're sacrificing something. If you're a business owner, an entrepreneur, and you have a hotel chain and you have all these different business ventures, using your own personal assets to run for candidacy to try to make an impact on the government to help make the lives of the American people better, that can be defined as servanthood just in and of itself. Now, some could argue that it's a form of egoism and narcissism, because that individual potentially wants control, or they want to turn this thing into a dictatorship, whatever. People use fear-mongering language all the time. But he has a dominant personality. So, of course, somebody who has a dominant personality, people will easily assign and label that person as narcissistic and egoistic. Now, anybody who runs for the presidency has a higher chance, on average, of having more narcissistic qualities. Any of them do. Why? Because somebody who has narcissistic tendencies tends to be less emotional based and more logical based. Remember when that thing where when I showed you here, well, I'll show you again. We'll do the share screen. We'll go back here. Somebody who tends to make decisions less on feeling and more on logic, that person tends to fit more into the criteria that somebody would have to meet in order for them to be considered narcissistic. Why? Because they're not considering necessarily the other people's feelings when they're having to make a decision. That doesn't mean they're a narcissist. You're not a freaking psychologist. You can't diagnose somebody unless you actually have a license. right? So before we just label somebody a narcissist, you have to have a preponderance of evidence to suggest that that's what that person is experiencing. And because personality disorders are pervasive and they're enduring, and they're typically lifelong, unless there's some radical transformative experience, kind of like what I had using psilocybin mushrooms, but we will just leave that aside for now. And we'll just talk about, in general, you can look at that individual and say that in the crux of the moment, if there's a major event or crisis that comes up, that person will be less likely to make a decision based off of feeling and more based off of fact. That's just generally speaking for most presidential candidates. You want to have somebody who can be balanced in their decision making and not be swayed by emotional pleas. Now, I'm going to take that for a second. We're going to go, and I'm glad I paired this right away with my point number 4 that I made for myself, which was I want a candidate who does have empathy. Now, this is very difficult. I have a great deal of empathy. I've always had a great deal of empathy ever since I was a young little child. I was abused by my own mother. Both of my parents were alcoholics. I had a very turbulent environment. My mom couldn't handle my crying. She would lock me in the closet as a young child. I developed a heightened sensitivity to my environment as a survival skill, right? That is the extreme. When you think of somebody, and I've had to do a lot of therapy, I've had to do a lot of self-work, I have to do a lot of balance work, I do exercise, I do a lot of things to bring myself back down into a grounded state so that not every stimulus is sending me off into some type of dissociative event or some type of struggle mentally or anxiety. I don't really have a lot of that anymore, but we'll just use that in my life as a living example to say that you generally want to have somebody who can understand the plight of the common man. They need to understand it and make decisions based off of a set of shared common goals. That's where the rubber meets the pavement. In order to reduce suffering for that common person and to maximize human potential for development, it's good to have a candidate who has empathy, who can relate to the emotions that other people are experiencing when they are suffering, whether they are poor or they've lost a loved one, or there's crime, or there's drug epidemics going on. You want a presidential candidate that will be able to have empathy for those individuals. That is a good quality to have. Not so much empathy that they become paralyzed to make decisions when decisions need to be made, but enough empathy to where that they can understand your problem if you have a problem. Right. So I was thinking about that, and I was just thinking, yeah, this is good. Number 5, informed without bias. This is why it's so important, in my opinion, that presidential candidates do a very good job of selecting the people in their cabinet, the people that they will surround themselves with. And obviously, some of the discourse out there can point to the previous presidency with Donald Trump and criticize potentially his own cabinet. And when things went bad, he would fire them and blame them for their issues. Like, you can look at that as a failure of leadership. And obviously it was, but it's that individual candidate's job to become informed without bias. So you need to hire people if you're going to become a presidential candidate, and you can use this lens to look at somebody. Who are they selecting as their candidate? Who are they going to bring alongside them into the office? And what do they need? They need people that don't always agree with them. Why? Well, that's critical, because you need to have people who are not just going to be yes men and tell you and be like, this is a great idea, President. That's a great idea. And just to conflagrate your ego, just pat you on the back and say, oh, great job. This is a great idea. No, You need to have people that will challenge you when you're wrong or when you might be misinformed. The candidate needs to seek people and information to find out the exact nature of the problems facing their own families, community, country, and the world. So not just macro issues, the things that are happening on or micro issues, that things are happening on a micro scale, whether that's in their own family or their own community or their own country, but macro as well, to be able to know and understand and be informed without bias to what the nature of things that are going on and the exact nature of what's going on in the world around them. Okay. So if you think about Putin, by the way, so President Putin, one of the critiques about President Putin is that he's not getting good information, that he's surrounded by a bunch of yes men or people that are afraid of him, and they potentially are really in it for their own gain, whether that's wealth, fame, power, control, and they're skewing his decision making. Woo, that's a pretty nice sounding car there. That's one of the critiques, because as a president, your job is to be well informed. If you're not well informed, then the chances of you making a good decision for the people that are in your country are going to be a lot less beneficial. So again, you just think about that. I don't want to vote for a president that has a bunch of yes men surrounding him. As a leader, you need to be challenged by the people underneath you, or not underneath you, the people that are around you. So that was number 5. And when I think about that, I do. That is, again, that's another critique that I have of President Trump. That I do think that if he gets elected, he needs to challenge himself. If he wants to be a good president this time around, if he gets voted in, he needs to challenge himself by bringing in people who are smarter than him, who will challenge him, who will help him become the better version of himself. And that's the difficult thing for somebody who potentially has some elements of indiscriminate narcissistic qualities. Now, again, I'm not labeling him as a narcissist. I'm not a psychologist. Although I have a doctorate level education in psychology, I don't have a psychological license. I don't have a doctorate level license, so I can't label him as a narcissist. And I think it would be presumptuous to do so without the competencies that it requires in order to label somebody as that. And I hate labeling people to begin with. So I wouldn't do that. But I would say, based off of the information that I've seen and heard, there is a high likelihood that he has some of those characteristics. So what does he need to offset that if he's going to have a successful presidency? He needs to have non-yes man around him, men and women, people who will challenge him to become a better version of himself. And that's, if you think about it, you got to Goggins it, right? You got to David Goggins it, man. You have to put yourself through the trial to become a better person. If you don't do that, then you'll never become the best version of yourself. So if you want to appeal to somebody who has narcissistic qualities, you have to challenge them to and really truly get at the core of what it is that they need to become. You make it a lot less about their feelings. You appeal to the ideal. Dear President, I want you to be the best version of the presidency that has ever been. Whatever you want to do to appeal to that individual, it doesn't matter. The point is, you want them to become the best version of themselves. For what? For the sake of the people, because it's the people that he's serving. So that's what we think of. That's what I want. Right. So if he does win or gets elected as the candidate for from the Republican Party, I really pray strongly that he surrounds himself with people who have high integrity, who have a high level of assertiveness, who will speak up for themselves and not cower to somebody who has a more dominant personality. Dominant personalities. Listen, I married a covert narcissistic individual, or somebody who has a high degree of narcissism that was used covertly. And I was constantly surrounded by individuals like that in my lifetime, bosses, leaders, all sorts of individuals who had those things. And it wasn't until I gained my own confidence and did my own healing work that I started to become more assertive. So I care a hell of a lot less about what somebody thinks about me now than what it used to be. So I wouldn't have any fear of working around a narcissist, somebody who has high dominance character traits like a President Trump, because I would tell him what I think and what I feel. Why? Because of servanthood. Because the idea is you want to bring the best out of that other individual so that they will become the best version of themselves for the sake of the people. So I challenge President Trump to do that. Don't be a weak man. If you don't want to be perceived as a weak man, bring people into your party, into your candidate, like bring people in that will challenge you to become the best version of yourself. Don't surround yourself with echo chambers, right? So that's that. Now, number 6. Number 6. Noble, gallantry, chivalry. I think of a president, I think of JFK. Now, of course, we know that he had infidelity, he had some character issues, he also had a drug addiction. He got sober, but he still had a drug addiction. However, if you look at his service and his military service, he was somebody who earned honors for his military service despite having major medical issues. He had major back problems and a lot of back pain. And yet he squeaked into the service anyway so that he could serve his country. To me, that's noble, that's gallant, that's somebody who has chivalrous nature. Now, he got a little distracted once he, with the whole Marilyn Monroe thing. But let's be honest, folks, if you had the level of influence that he did, and there was a Marilyn Monroe around you, you would have to have some serious levels of fidelity. I believe I do, and I would pass that test, but there are individuals that will fail that test when they're presented with the opportunity to use their power and their authority. You think about somebody like Bill Clinton, for example. Same thing with JFK. These guys who got to the pinnacle of their success, and then they use that opportunity to for their own pleasure. So we don't want that. But if you just look at his military service, for example, that was noble, that was gallant. I would want to elect somebody who has chivalrous traits in them, as opposed to our current society and mass media and TikTok and all these things that would have you believe that being a man is bad, and having chivalry nature and being noble and gallant, that there's something wrong with that. I would challenge you to think that you're ignoring our entire human history. You're ignoring the role of a man from our entire history. And when you think of a man, you want to think of somebody who is like Moses, somebody like Jesus, somebody like Joshua, these men, David, that exemplify nobility, gallantry, and chivalry. Men that will protect with their own life the lives of the people around them, especially women. Why? Because they're more vulnerable. They're the weaker sex when it comes to biological, right? They may have more intelligence. Generally speaking, if you look at the statistics, women tend to be more intelligent, but they also tend to be more biologically frail, right? Their bone structure, their bone density is less. Their muscles are in less altered or genetically predisposed to higher muscle tissue. They tend to have a smaller muscle mass than men. It's just a fact, right? Facts over feelings. So instead of listening to the last 5 to 10 years of wokeism and thinking that as a feminist that you're going to be better off with a president who is appealing and pandering to you, I would challenge you. Would you marry that person? No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't marry a beta male. I wouldn't. You make yourself weaker. You make your society weaker. You make your children weaker. Well, in order. You make yourself weaker. You make your spouse weaker. You make your children weaker. You make your society weaker. The predominant job of a female is to have the highest degree of mate selection possible. That's your job. You are to select the best high quality mate that you can find. That's your job as a female. Our job, our role as a male is to make ourselves the best version of ourselves so that we can attract the highest quality female. It makes sense. It's magnetic. You want that. That's the epitome of our mate selection. If you believe in evolution, you can't ignore science to say that if you select the highest value mate in your category, you're going to end up with the best quality offspring, which is going to create the best quality tribe, which is going to create the best quality country. This is why birth control is a problem, and I'll explain that in a minute. If you're like David and you faced the giant, what happened? He became king. He became the anointed son of God and was crowned king. He was the youngest son, not the eldest. That was traditionally the place for the eldest son. But in God's providence, as a symbol and a parable for that, the son of David would become God, and that was fulfilled through Jesus, the Messiah. The point is, you may have somebody who comes along the way that may appear as though they don't deserve something. Like, if you think about like the medieval knights, right? Typically they came from more royal family, and they came from a distinguished line, patrons of people who had money, access, influence, and their family lineage. That's how you became a knight. But did being a knight make you chivalrous? No. We know that now. We know that from history, that there are individuals that went rags to riches, just like David, who were at the bottom threshold of society, but yet there was something noble in their heart. David was a shepherd boy. There was something noble and gallant inside of him that God saw and elevated him to the position of knighthood. And he went out and he killed Goliath. He faced his giants. So going back to birth control, here's the problem scientifically. Here's the problem with what the birth control pills do to the biology of a female. They trick you into believing that you're pregnant. What happens when you believe that? What happens to your body? You just look at the biomarkers and the chemicals of what they're doing to a female body when they're giving it a pill. It's essentially tricking them into thinking that they're pregnant. When women are pregnant, what happens? They're not looking for a mate. So they will accept a communal equal, somebody who that would just at a minimum be around them, be willing to be around them, to be in a relationship with them. They are in a vulnerable state when they are pregnant. And what you're finding now, and not just anecdotal research, but we're talking about legitimate research, and then also in addition, in anecdotal stories where you have these women who are on birth control for an extended period of time. They're in a relationship with a man, and all of a sudden they get off birth control. And what happens? They can't even stand being around that guy anymore. And then they realize, holy shit, I've been dating a beta male for this entire time when I was on this pregnancy pill, the birth control. Now, of course, again, I'm not trying to come against birth control in general, because there are incidences that it helps curve major issues. I was dating a lady who had severe bleeding with her ovaries, and she had cysts on them. And the only way that she could minimize the bleeding was being on birth control. God bless her heart. I prayed for her. I actually miss her, and I want to, just pray for her, because she really struggled. And it reminded me of the story of the bleeding woman in Jesus's time, the one that touched his robe and was healed. Because there are people out there that are suffering because of their own biological issues as a female. So yeah, like I empathize with that, but at the same time, let's look at that and have a true conversation. That is this really the best thing for our species? Is it the best? If it's not the best, then we need people who are noble, gallant, chivalrous, scientific, theoretical, and relatable to come in and try to give us a better leadership to say, hey, look, people, I'm not going to take away your ability to get birth control if you need it. But here's what the research is saying, people, listen to me. There's women out there that are not selecting the best quality person, and they're regretting it later on after they get off of birth control. So there needs to be a more education for these young women that are getting put on birth control in their teens. There are some women that are getting put on birth control in their teens, and then they're not able to get pregnant as they get older. So there's these confounding variables that we need to be able to look at as a society, and we need to have a presidential candidate who is going to understand these variables without bias, and be noble in the process. So let me go back to RFK Jr. Okay, here's my issue with RFK Jr. He's a Catholic, but he says that he's pro-choice. To me, that's a hypocrisy. You can't be Catholic from the traditional sense. If you actually are a Bible believing Catholic and a follower of Catholicism, especially Roman Catholicism, and you can't, there's no compatibility in those belief systems, because what does the Bible say? And this is what Catholics are supposed to be being taught as a young child, is that your job is to go be fruitful and to multiply. So if you prevent something, if you get in the way of that, you are sinning. That's essentially what the Bible is, or the Catholics believe, that they believe that it's a sin to prevent pregnancy. Now, I'll give you a life example. I wouldn't be alive personally. I wouldn't be living here and having this conversation with you if my grandparents weren't Catholic. My grandmother, my grandfather served honorably in World War II. He came back and they started pumping out kids, like Oprah handing out stuff in her shows, man. I mean, it was like one kid, hey, here you go. Here you cured another kid, another kid, another kid. They had 11, I believe 11. My mom was the third youngest child. Halfway through all these kids, they were having troubles providing for them. They couldn't economically keep up with it. So they went to their local parish, they talked to the priest, and they begged for her to be able to get put on birth control so that they could stop having all these kids, and so that they could gather themselves and be able to provide for these children. Now, there's a lot of complexity to this issue. It's not just a one-size-fits-all pill. It's a complex issue that takes in spiritual, religious, biological, relational, communal. It's a highly complex topic to talk about. But at the end of the day, if you have a candidate that says that he's a God-fearing Catholic, but then on the other hand says that he's pro-choice, what is he saying? He's saying that he's okay with abortion, and he's advocating for a principle of murdering a child before it's born. Now, I'm using that language. Of course, there's going to be people that oppose it, but at the same time, I have to be able to express what I believe. I believe that the sanctity of human life is paramount. Each life is an image of God, and to kill that person is killing. It's a sin. So to me, it becomes more about what I don't like it being black and white. So if I was to have a debate with somebody like an RFK Jr., I would tell him, look, I'd vote for you if it wasn't for this issue, because there's too much hypocrisy in what you think you stand for and what you're actually doing and saying. I wouldn't be alive if my mother wasn't born. Obviously, my mother struggled. They had a lot of problems. Our whole family tree suffered, but I made a conscious decision to break the cycle, the generational cycle of trauma and abuse. I consciously made that decision for myself, that I would be the last person in my family that would continue on and pass that sin on to my children. That's what I've made the decision for. That's why I got sober. I absolutely committed to it. And I said that I want to get sober. I don't want to continue to do this. And we have to make this same decision as a country if we want our country to be the exemplary nation or the free nation of the world. How do we get there? Well, it's not so black and white. It's not so black and white to just be able to say pro-choice or pro-life. It's not that easy. If it was that easy, we would have fixed it already. And here's how. When you think about and this is scientific, by the way, if you want to look at the higher numbers of abortions, who is having the highest number of abortions? Black women. Black women are the highest number of preterm abortions in the country. What does that say? Well, it gives you a starting point. It gives you some data to suggest that there's something going on in the community that is allowing a continuous problem to not be addressed. And as a president, your job isn't to just take away their choices without understanding the consequences. That's the problem. Because as soon as we get into the allegiances of pro-life and pro-choice, all of a sudden you're missing the person. You're missing the person that is going through this life who, when they get pregnant, they're all of a sudden terrified with this idea of having to try to give birth to a child that they can't afford, that they're not ready for, or that they're not going to be supported in once that child's born, right? Of course, we want to have a representative from the Black community to be able to speak for themselves. Like, we can't just assume that a white privileged male, when I say privileged, of course, I'm making a joke here about white privilege, but you don't want to have a predominantly Caucasian male making a decision without having adequate information from a representative of a community that is struggling with these types of decisions. Because it's not an easy decision. And although it might be easy to label it and just write it off as a Black problem, or label it off as like a poor people's problem, the reality is that it's a problem and it's not being adequately addressed. And my proposal, if I was to sit there across from somebody like RFK Jr., I would challenge his science. I would ask him to look at this from a holistic wellness perspective, that this isn't just an individual choice or right. This is a societal issue that has to be addressed from multiple perspectives in multiple ways. It can't just be yes or no, kill or not kill. That's black and white thinking. You would think that an evolved species at this point would have gotten to a better way of handling premarital sex and these types of issues. We have obviously fallen so far away from our faith and our spiritual principles, where sex is treated as a transaction and we're celebrated for being free sex people. Like, we could just have sex with whomever we want, whenever we want. But these are choices that have serious long-term consequences. Having sex, especially like when I was 13, the first time I had some type of a sexual experience. Well, I had actually before that, unfortunately, and it wasn't my choice. But I'm talking about my own choice. I was forced into things when I was really young that I wasn't prepared for. But my own hormones started kicking in around 13, and that was the first time I started having premarital sexual issues, right? Like, at a really young age, I didn't have any guidance from my parents. I didn't have any guidance from my community, and I certainly didn't have any guidance from my church. So if you want to think about this, if as a presidential candidate, what is the job here? I personally believe that it's a failure of parenting way before it's a failure of a president. It's a personal failure, and it is a communal failure that we have these young children, like I was, who was experimenting with sexuality from such an extremely young age. Now, of course, somebody like me who had unwanted sexual experiences from a very young age. My idea of sex was highly tainted from the time that I was wee little. There needed to be some type of psychological intervention for my family to be able to not only heal my issues, but my mother's issues, because she was responsible for the decisions that she made that caused the issues that I had. So in order to break this cycle, we have to start viewing this as a generational problem. This isn't just women's rights, you telling me what to do, yes or no, kill or not to kill. This isn't so black and white. This has to be an individual choice of A, raising up our children in the way that they should go, because later they won't depart from it. And B, understanding things from a contextual framework. Those two things. Like, I would challenge Robert and just say, if you really get to the core of it, what's the issue? What's the true issue behind all of the facade and all of the bias? And instead of trying to appeal to your base so that you can get more votes, what's the crux of the issue? It's a personal responsibility choice. And who's responsible? It's the parents, and it's the boys, and it's the men, training men up. Well, we'll get to women's responsibility in this into a minute, but our job is to raise young men with integrity. That's our job. The teenage life is the hardest. That was the pun intended, I guess. Teenagers, it's the hardest time. It's the most difficult. I need to really change my verbiage here. It is the most difficult time to start going through puberty and having all of these urges and hormones. And if you have psychological issues on top of that, it makes things 10 times more difficult. So what should we do? Well, the job of a leader is to inspire young men to become the best versions of themselves. You have to focus them on purpose. Men need, and again, I need to be very careful with my word selection here, but they need hands-on. They need hands-on education. We can't be having all these boys sit in a classroom, sitting behind a desk, and forcing them to become women, because that's essentially what our public education system became. It was run by women, and we forced young boys into a classroom, sitting behind a desk, and forcing them to try to act and be like women. That's not how men operate. Generally speaking, men do best when they're out in the environment, they're practicing their abilities, and they have hands-on education, learning how to do skills and trades with their hands, learning how to actually apply scientific methods with their hands. You get them out and about, and you actually have them practice, and you train them up, and you educate them, and you give them the best opportunity to develop a skill, right? Because what happens? Well, boys get bored, and when they get distracted and bored, what do? They start looking at girls, man. That's all they had to do. I mean, that's literally all I did in my pastime, was I would be looking at pornography all the time. So it's a complex issue, but it's really the job of the parent. And so we need to have a president that is going to inspire parents to do their job. And if you're afraid to tell that to people as a president, that like, I'm going to do my job as a president, but your job as a parent is to train your children up in the way that they should go. And if you're not doing it right, then yes, as a president, I can bring attention to that issue. We can try to bring in legislation that's going to help parents co-parent from a better framework, but we can't tell people how to parent. That's ultimately their choice. And that's the mistake I think that the left has made, is trying to make it a political issue instead of what it really is, which is a spiritual issue. Why? Because what does the Bible say? Our fight is not with flesh and blood, but what? It's against the rulers and the principles in the dark places. It's against the principalities of this world. You can't distort that sexual immorality is at the very core of one of our biggest sin issues in the world. And if you're truly a Catholic and you truly believe what the scripture says about this being a spiritual battle, well, then that is your job, is to face the giant, to face it down, and to look at it and can not, it's to call sin a sin, not to condemn people, because that's not what Jesus did. He gave people opportunity to repent. Now, if you do get the information and you are presented with the truth, and then you choose to go against that, well, then what? You have to be willing to experience the consequences of your choices. And guess what? If you're having sex, there's a consequence. So if you're a female that gets pregnant because you're having consensual sex, then guess what? You need to experience the consequence of your choices. If you're a male that is having sex, even if you're young, you need to experience the consequences of your choices. And of course, we can try to say, oh, yes, wear a condom. Yes, here's birth control, all these different options. And we can try to force feed sex education from the other. Yes, of course, there's data that suggests that the earlier that you start that conversation with children about healthy decisions, you're teaching them what? How to think. You're not telling them what to do necessarily. You're expressing to them how to think. Men need chastised hearts. They need leadership. They need purpose. Without that, they are going to end up having premarital sex, and they're going to end up screwing this whole thing up. Again, word choices, probably should think about my words, but at the same time, that complex issue, you need to have somebody like me who is thinking critically about this from multiple lenses and multiple frames, thinking about this as somebody who's struggled with sexual sin for 40 years of my life and only recently has been able to get healed from all of that stuff, and is living a life of celibacy and is living a life of sexual purity. The further we get away from that, the further I'm less likely to vote for you as a Bible-fearing Christian. Like, I love you, RFK, and number ones and twos and threes and all of those points that I had talked about. I would have voted for you if it wasn't for your black and white pro-choice allegiance, because it's not an allegiance that I can identify with. And to me, the issue is sexual sin. It's not your allegiance. And if you can't call a sin, then I can't call you my president. So it's tough. But it's just, and it's what does it say in the Bible? It says that the truth will set you free. So the truth is, we need to have more consequences in place for people who are having premarital sex. There needs to be a framework of responsibility that the parents need to take on if their children get pregnant out of wedlock and they get, and because what generally what happens? Well, it ends up that usually it's the female's parents that end up having to raise that child. Well, you need to have the responsibility of the boy's parents involved in some shape, way, and form, whether that's financially, relationally, etc. Because on the other end of that spectrum, you also have what then happens is fathers are then cut off from their own children, like I was, wrongly, unjustly. Kids were taken away from me, and the court system was used to take away my rights and to take my kids away so that I had no influence, no connection, no relationship with them. So again, it's a complex issue, but in present day, I truly don't see a support system around the framework of what? The family, because that's what this is all about. The devil wants nothing more than to tear down the image of God. And what is the image of God? Well, the image of God is supported by the idea of what? A man and a woman and a family. And he loves tearing away at the fabric of our society by separating fathers from children, by allowing young men to be governed by their own desires, to get these young girls pregnant or whatever age. But still, the point is, you have this frivolous sexual pervasiveness in our society where pornography is accessible to everybody at any time. And for a man, I got to be honest, it is the most difficult thing for somebody who ever has had some type of sexual trauma in their youth to have no treatment, no mental health access and awareness for that, and to then be thrust. Oh my God, my word choice. To be sent off into adult life with a handicap, right? There's a reason why NoFap is such a popular thing right now. Why so many guys are going to NoFap? Because what they're realizing is that they're weakening themselves by giving into temptation, by being obsessed with porn. It's reducing their own virileness, and it's incrementally deteriorating their brain. It messes up their dopamine system. You just listen to Andrew Huberman for a while. In the same way, there's these young 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old boys who are getting access to these phones, and all they're doing is they're destroying their dopamine system from an early age. Well, guess what happens when they hit puberty? They have little to no self-regulation, none. So again, this is not just pro-life, pro-choice. This is a family problem. This is a parenting problem. This is a spiritual problem. And unless a presidential candidate can stand up for that, somebody who will advocate for the family, traditional family values, I can't vote for you. So I would hope that, you take that into consideration. That was a very long point number 6 discussion about nobility, gallantry, and chivalry. But I had to say it. I had to speak my mind, because it's been tumbling through my mind for years and years and years and years about the nature of addictions. And I would include sexual immorality as an addiction, because I used it to cope with my own issues. Now, number 7, humility. I want to vote for a president that has humility. Now, let's say RFK Jr., for example, if he had the humility to admit that this is a complex issue and that he would be willing to look at information and access to, let's say, for example, let me read the definition first, and then I'll go to give some examples of ways that I would personally like to advocate to combat some of these issues going on in our society, in our country here. Humility: admit when he or she is wrong. Seek to correct your own mistakes. Don't lament continuously on their faults, living in shame or guilt, but takes adequate steps to solve them. So if there's a gap in your leadership, you admit it when you recognize it, somebody brings it to your attention, and then you take steps to change that issue, to address that concern. So again, if I'm a presidential candidate like RFK Jr. and somebody like me comes along and you hear this and you say, oh, shoot, you know what? He might be right. This isn't just such a pro-choice, pro-life deal. We need to have an actual discussion about this, an ongoing series of discussions on how to prop up the image of the family. Now, I'll give you an example of how. So I feel like we already have the answers. Number 1, of course, Jesus is the answer. I'll always put that first and just say, I think God is the answer. But there are practical things that we can actually implement and prop up as a presidential candidate. And if you become a president, things that you can advocate for, because it's not just taking away women's rights. This is about surrounding young men and women with the right types of supports who are what? More vulnerable to making decisions that have long-term severe consequences. So what do we know? We know that individuals who don't have good parent figures, or parent figures that are consistent, continuous, and what are those parenting? There's a parenting style framework, but parents that don't train their children in the right ways, we know that they struggle the most. And who struggles the most? People in poverty, people who don't have access to good mental health, people who don't have good access to actual supports around them to be able to give them their own needs getting met, and then also then passing that down along to their kids. It reminded me of this young girl that got pregnant. I think she was 15 years old when she got pregnant, and she was a hot mess, man. And the boy couldn't be a father, so she ended up having to try to do it on her own. 15 years old, single mother. I mean, and I'm sure they get younger. I'm sure there's younger mothers than that. But how do we address it? So first of all, I actually worked in a program, a psychological based treatment program, and I was working for an agency called Blair Family Solutions. Shout out to Scott Lambert. He's such an incredible man. And Blair Family Solutions and Jody Crust. God bless you, Jody. I love you. I miss you, and I wish to come and have some lunch with you at some point, and sit down and talk about the further development of what you guys are doing in the community there. Because she's such a fantastic servant of God. She's a Catholic, and I love her to death. I'm not necessarily, I wouldn't say that I'm a Catholic person practicing, but I don't condemn or criticize Catholics. I think that they're Christians too. Anywho, long story short, Blair Family Solutions is a fantastic agency, because what they did, what they have been doing for a long time, is they've been doing mental health for children, youth, family for such a long time, that they have such a good reputation for treating people like a person-centered approach, treating them how they should be treated, and acting as a support system, a support network around them. And there's many different ways and shapes that you can do that. Number one, case management. Case management means that if a financial need comes up, or if an appliance breaks, or if a child needs to get to a medical appointment, guess what? Blair Family Solutions has a case management program that will offer a service to people of low income and get them to their medical appointments. Obviously, that's incredibly important, that children get access to quality healthcare, quality mental health care, quality amounts of food. You know, we want to try to give each child the best opportunity to grow up with their needs being met as possible, because we know that it's an investment, right? Because what we're doing is it's like a long-term investment. If you think about Warren Buffett, he always invests in something that he sees a long-term potential in. Generally speaking, I don't think he's a short seller. He's looking to invest in something that has a long-term arc. And what is a human life? It's the greatest asset that was ever created, because if you can raise up a child in the way that they should go, you're creating an investment. And what happens at the end of that investment? You get the payoff. You get a citizen who is producing quality goods or services to another individual and society, for themselves and for their society, right? That's what we're trying to do, right? So again, this isn't about killing people, your greatest asset. This is about surrounding your greatest assets, your children, your youth. This is surrounding them with the right support systems. And there's a mental health program in particular that I think we need to expand, and that needs to be highly examined to make a national model from what is already in place. Now, it's in Pennsylvania. I don't know if it's in other states. I do think it might be in Maryland, but it's called the CSBBH program. It actually used to be called the Clinical Homes Program. And in fact, you know what? Just give me a second here. I'm going to pull this up. I'm going to type this in here. CSBBH program. Community and school-based behavioral health. All right. So I'm going to share my screen, because I think this is absolutely critical. If we want to tackle issues like childhood pregnant or early, like teen pregnancy, if we want to tackle issues, we got to start early. We have to start early. And this is an example it's a community care and behavioral health organization. So CCBH is actually the organization that advocates for this. They do the training for it. They're funded by social services money. They're funded by the federal government. So these funds come in through the federal government and are then allocated to CCBH, who then trains and oversees the implementation of a CSBBH service. Now, the CSBBH service is provided by an agency, a mental health agency who hires clinical staff, master's levels, bachelor's levels, and even doctorate level. So they have a psychologist, they have a master's level clinician and social workers, they have bachelor's levels, community health, behavioral health providers that will go into the schools and be in the school to help children who already have some type of vulnerability, whether that's a medical and or a mental health disability. They will give children the best opportunity to succeed in their daily life. And that is not just in school, because what they do is they assign a master's level clinician to work with not just the kid, but also with the parents or a single mother. So if you have a single mother who is having trouble raising young boys, which I actually worked in a school for a couple of years, and I worked with a lot of single mothers. If you want to break that cycle, you have to support them, and they need to have some type of paternal, I'm trying to, a figure, somebody who's going to come in and surround them and protect them. Right now, of course, we want to empower women to be strong and powerful and independent. Sure, that sounds great in theory, but when they have young children, they're vulnerable. And oftentimes what happens is their mental state starts to decline, and they really struggle in life unless they're supported by some type of community environment. Now, if they have family members, that's great. Sometimes they can rely on their grandparents or their own parents to help them raise the kids and give that parent a break. But what happens in my personal and professional experience is oftentimes single mothers are usually left having to deal with these raising their children on their own unless they're supplemented with some type of community and school-based intervention program. And in my opinion, I think we need to look at this type of program, and we need to look at the study. We need to look at the data that talks about the reduction of symptoms, not just for the children, but also for the parent. Because it's not just single mothers I would work with. I was working with autistic kids too, and I was working with their parents. And sometimes you would have great parents that just so happen to have an autistic kid. Doesn't mean that they were bad parents or that they were spiritually poor. It just meant that, guess what? They had a child who had an autism, and now they had to face that. And it's very difficult to face that when you're facing that on your own. So what do you want to do as a president? You want to advocate for the people who are vulnerable and who need actual tangible help. If single mothers are a problem, you address it using the treatment programs that are already in place and giving you the best opportunity to help offer a supplement, an option to these women, instead of saying, okay, well, it's either get abortion or don't, and suffer with the consequence. I don't believe that's how Jesus would want to handle that. I would say, in my opinion, based off of what I know about the Bible, it would be have the child, and then offer that woman and child and paternal father, the person who got that woman pregnant, offer them a psychological community behavioral health system that is going to help them learn how to co-parent together. Because even if they don't remain in that relationship, which often happens, even if they don't remain in that relationship, that child needs to have a mother and a father figure. They need it. They need to have it. And if they don't have it, it interrupts the rhythm of that child's development. It's scientific fact. This is not feeling. This is a proven fact, or it's a proven. Well, of course, when you say things that are proven, you're not necessarily supposed to say that from a scientist. It's highly suggested based off of the data that we can inference, blah, blah, blah. Look, I can get into semantics about the difference between fact and feeling, But the point is, if you have enough data, you can pretty reasonably suggest that you need to have some type of service program that surrounds these people who are struggling. So let's take a 16-year-old Black girl who is living with her mother, who's also a single mother, who gets pregnant by, let's say, a 17-year-old boy who is also being raised by a single mother. What are you going to do? Do you just have the abortion and move on with your life? Well, guess what? That affects their mental health and their well-being, not just the woman, but also the boy. It does. It absolutely does. Why? Because you can see it in their psychometrics later on in life when you start seeing their behaviors and you see the manifestations of all sorts of different types of behavioral health issues, whether that's addictions, whether that's mental health illnesses. It's pervasive. It's not just handled at the abortion. So it's not just a solution. You can't just offer somebody some form of birth control and just think that that's going to handle the solution, handle the problem, right? I think personally, we as a society, especially in the United States, need to look at the implementation of what's already working, because it's giving us a way to surround these vulnerable populations with tangible resources, not just money, but therapists that will come in and that will help them on those rough days. Because I can tell you, and I'll probably get a little emotional here, but as a therapist, I would go in and there are those rough days where there are these women who are single mothers who are pouring out and doing everything that they can to try to raise these kids, and they're struggling without having a paternal figure in place. Almost all of them, almost all of the single mothers that I ever worked with, they always lamented not having a quality father figure in their life to help support them through that process. Of course, that's what they lamented. And as a man who has also lost my children to a tragic court system, who blindly accepts the word of a mother who used the court system to lie under oath to get me away from my kids so that she could get the kids to maintain her reputation in front of other people in her family. She also had addiction issues that she wasn't admitting. We both had problems, and we needed something like this. We needed a community and school-based behavioral health. And in fact, I asked the VA if they had anything like this. Of course, they didn't. In fact, I reached out to the agency that I used to work for to see if they could provide this service to us, because I knew we needed the help. And I had asked for it 2 years prior to our divorce and our separation and divorce. And unfortunately, I found out that because I had worked for the agency, I couldn't actually get this treatment for my family, from me, my ex, because I knew that her tendency would be to blame and shame, project, reject, and to separate me from my kids. My worst fear ever. And it came true. And if you think about self-fulfilling prophecies, these are the issues that we deal with in society, because it's not just women's rights, it's also the rights of the father. And when you separate the father from their children, it is a psychological break that happens. Have you ever been around a girl who had their parents divorced at a younger age? What happens? Let's just look at some your own personal experiences. You ever been around a woman who from a young age their parents divorced? What happens? Well, typically either they start having sex earlier, or they have identity issues. They start developing body dysmorphia issues. A lot of them will develop some form of bulimia or anorexia, or some way psychologically to try to cope with that issue. It's a grief issue. Now, if you have healthy parents, two people who are going through a divorce, of course, they can work things out and it can be somewhat seamless. And of course, the kids can move on better. But does that happen often? Or in my case, I was scapegoated and basically turned into the leper of my family, and she kept the kids for her own selfish reasons, and the kids suffered. I know for a fact because I haven't seen my kids in 2 years. I know for a fact when I talked to one of them, my youngest son is suicidally depressed. My oldest daughter went into substances and started using drugs and alcohol. Again, I'm not blaming just my ex. This is a problem that I take responsibility for as a man, number one, because I chose the wrong partner in the relationship. And you know, in the marital vows, it says in sickness and health. Well, when my mental health declined, she ran because I couldn't hold a job anymore. She wanted me for my potential. And just like in any type of relationship with somebody who has narcissistic tendencies, when they start to see that that person doesn't hold the value anymore, that they're not able to provide that same level of wealth to that person or abundance in some way or shape or form, whether it's attention, wealth, riches, fame, status, popularity, they go through what's called the discarding phase, and they will cast that person off. They'll alienate them from their family, their kids, and they'll take everything that they ever owned. And I went through that process personally. So I bring that up as a salient point, as a poignant issue, as a personal example of how a community and a school-based behavioral health service could have helped. And here's how they could have helped. Number one, they would have helped come with me to the court, and they would have advocated for my rights as a parent. They would have also reached out to her and advocated that she work issues out and communicate with me effectively. And then they would have done appointments at her house and wherever I was living. They would have the therapist go to both parents and have issues worked out. They would mediate those issues. They would do counseling with the kids to give them access to a third party to vent whatever is going on as a result of the tragedy or the grief or the loss of, because it is, when you in a child's mind, when they see two parents, they see one. Whenever they hear or see their parents arguing, it creates a split. Psychologically, it creates a split. It's traumatic for kids. And depending on the degree of the violenceness of their divorce or separation, and when I'm saying violence, I don't necessarily mean physical. I'm talking about how quick and how harsh that separation was. Like in my relationship, it was severed traumatically. So there was no support psychologically for my kids, even though I tried to advocate for it. And I tried to get Wounded Warrior Project involved, and I tried to get communities and school-based behavioral health services involved. My life was a perfect example of us falling in between the cracks of society. And that generational curse can be passed along down the line, because then what happens? The young girls will start to seek for what? Affection and attention to try to heal the wounds of the heart. What will boys do? They will try to find some way to distract themselves. They will try to find some way to satisfy their sexual needs. And so all you do is you recreate that cycle. And instead of it being, hey, let's heal the issues, it's, oh, well, put the girl on birth control, and that'll solve the problem. Or, oh, if the girl gets pregnant because she misses her dad really truly and wants to actually have a good relationship with her dad, but because of a selfish parent and because of a sinful, broken nature and a broken court system that doesn't actually advocate for the rights of a father, then what happens? Well, now you've got a generational cycle going on in the family that then starts to spill over into the community, and then spills over into your society. Teachers end up having to take on more responsibility. Police officers end up getting more involved in families with juvenile boys, because generally speaking, boys become more aggressive without having a strong paternal figure. So you see all these negative impacts that stem from not having the adequate supports around. And I believe if you look at it truly from a spiritual lens, what was the whole commission that God gave in the image of Adam and Eve? It was, yes, be fruitful and multiply, but it was to replicate this idea of family going forward throughout time. when you think about a family lineage, it's not just physical reproduction, but it's also the reproduction of values and morals and ethics that go along with that family. So if we want to have a more homogenous, well, I'm not even thinking of the word homogenous. If we want to have a more strong society, it's not coming from the top down. It's not coming from a president that implements women's rights and blah, blah, blah. It comes from within. It comes from men taking responsibility. It comes from men facing their fears and facing the giants. It comes from men mentoring young men and teaching them how to act and behave in society. It comes from women teaching, and men like fathers loving their daughters, filling and filling them with love so that they don't feel like they have to try to get it elsewhere. That's what it stems from. And women teaching women how to be better selectors of men. That's what it boils down to. And I just, oh, of course it's easy to try to blame my ex-wife for all of our family issues. That's not the truth. I will repeat this several times over. It was my problem from my family generational cycle of alcoholism, trauma, addictions, abuse, neglect. It created that void in my heart that then I tried to fill by bringing somebody in who initially sounded like somebody who was really sweet and charming. But once we got married, that flipped in an instant. And I essentially lived 20 years with a extremely mentally abusive, neglective mother, alcoholic mother, and then transitioned that into my mate selection, was compromised, and married a woman who essentially replicated what my mother did for the next 20 years. So 40 years of my life, 20 years of prison with my mom, 20 years of prison with my ex. And what did we create? Well, we created another system of generational family cycles of trauma that I promised to God that I would stand up for and speak out against these issues, to say, like, we need these types of community and school-based behavioral health programs, especially for people like me who never wanted to be separated. I never wanted to be taken away from my kids. I never wanted to have that. I loved my kids. So if you have a father who loves his kids and who wants to be around them and to be a good paternal father figure, why not have a program that helps support him, helps support the other co-parent, and helps support the kids? That's what we need. And we need presidencies. We need people who will see these issues as they are, who will speak the truth, who will have personal experience enough to advocate for the issues that are actually going on in society. That's where I'm at with it. I mean, I understand and respect other people's opinions, but at the same time, like, I know what I know because I've lived through what I've lived through, and I've studied at the highest level of education that we have available to us at a doctorate level. So I understand what I'm talking about when I talk about the issues going on psychologically. And then you couple that with the fact that I was also a spiritual person, always at heart, always believing in God, but having a combination of that, you need to have those two combined to become a servant leader, to embrace those qualities, those 7 factors that I mentioned in today's podcast. If you want to know who to vote for, know how to vote, know how to make decisions. And I think we need to be a better selector as a person individually, who we're going to choose as our representative, and think for ourselves, think critically about these issues. Because if you're just taking it at face value that, oh, well, if we just give women the right to have an abortion, that'll cure all society's issues, or, oh, if we just do X, Y, or Z, that's going to cure all society's issues. I would steer you away. I would encourage you to think more critically about this, because if it was that easy, it would have already solved the issues, but it's not, and it hasn't. So we live in a time where we need critical agents. We need critical agents that have critical thinking abilities, who are agents of change, who will be willing to stand up for righteousness and stand for what is truly right, not for what's right in the now, but what's for the right in the future. And I'll leave you with that message. I will share with you that I do believe that God is, and this is what the scripture says, that in the end times, or in the perilous times, if you want to call it the perilous times, that the hearts of the father will return. The farts of the father. Yeah, listen, I get those when I have protein shakes. I gotta tell you, man, oh my God. Protein, like especially wheat that has any type of wheat gluten in it, like whey-based proteins. I don't know, man. I need to create my own protein shake, because any kind of wheat or wheat gluten really makes me gassy. TMI. But anywho, the point is, well, what was the point that I was making? Oh man, see, that's what happens when fathers. The hearts of the fathers will be returned towards the children, and the hearts of the children will be turned towards the fathers. And when you have that, when you have men standing up for righteousness, they are going to chastise their own hearts before God. They are going to submit to the Lord to show them how to become a better man. And as a result of that, you're going to see incremental change, and it'll be exponential when you see it at the pinnacle of our society, which is the presidency, because they're supposed to be representatives of a man that is a servant leader. So I'll leave you with that, and I will see you in the next episode.